Seth, what are we talking about tonight?
I think it's this strange thing called the Enneagram.
Yeah, but what about it?
We are, oh, sorry, there we go. You're right. Sorry. We're talking about, last week we talked about the 8, 9, and 1, the gut triad, like you just mentioned. Tonight we're talking about the 2, 3s, and 4s. They are in what's called the emotional or the heart or the feeling triad.
All right, raise your hand real quick if you think you might be a 2, 3, or 4. Okay.
Oh, okay.
All right. This is good.
Cool, yeah. So real quick, we're getting at the triads here. The triads are about what's called centers of intelligence. Everybody has a center of intelligence, or all 3 centers of intelligence. This is how we think in the world, how we feel in the world, and how we instinctively respond in the world. So we're talking about 2, 3, 4s, and they are in what's called the heart center. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you kind of the theme, the major theme, that the 2, 3s, and 4s are why they're connected together, why they're in the heart triad. So 2, 3s, and 4s all have strengths and liabilities having to do with emotions, having to do with feelings. That's why they're all grouped together in the feeling triad. So the major themes, oh cool, it's up there. So the major themes for the 2, 3s, and 4s triad is that they're all concerned with their self-image, and they tend to have issues with identity, and so they're seeking attention. And all 2, 3s, and 4s have an underlying core emotion of shame or sadness. And then there's what's in each one of the triads. There's sort of the externalized version of the triad. That's the first number, the 2. Then there's the number that's out of touch with that theme of the triad, and then there's the one that internalizes. So the 2 is the most outward and most obvious of the triad. The 3 is out of touch, and the 4 is internalizing. And that's sort of the pattern throughout each of the triads. Cool. So I think we're going to jump right into the descriptions of the types. Matt, you ready? You guys ready? Cool. So jumping in here, the 2 is often called the helper or the giver. 2s have a few key motivations. They need to be loved and valued, to express their positive feelings toward others, to meet the needs of others, to be appreciated, and to avoid feelings of being unworthy. 2s care deeply about people and are adept at recognizing and meeting other people's needs. They're open and naturally empathetic. They offer their heartfelt support, and they're deeply attuned to others. And so they're generous, and they know how to attune to people with kindness. But 2s can tend to believe that you won't be there for them if they're not doing things for you. So 2s' self-worth can be readily heightened or deflated by how others respond to them, because again they're in the emotional triad, having to do with identity. So 2s kind of think, I'm okay if you're okay. 2s deny their own needs to help other people. So they give and give and give until they're empty, all the while expecting us to do the same when they have an issue or a need. But because they actually never voice the fact that they have a need, they can find themselves hurt or angry with you, because their whole point of their existence is they're giving to you all the time, and so they kind of don't have their own needs. So 2s have this, every type has sort of an unconscious need. That's one of the titles that every type has. So the 2's unconscious need is to be needed by other people, largely because what they fear most is being unloved or unwanted for being purely themselves. Their core desire is to feel loved and wanted for being themselves only. So 2s walk into a room and subconsciously think, who's in need, and how can I gain love by meeting that need? 2s have a focus of attention. This is, again, sort of how the type's energy naturally gravitates towards something without thinking. So the 2's focus of attention is on approval for the self. And they do this by meeting your needs. So 2s can also tend to manipulate others by finding out other people's needs and desires, thus creating dependencies. 2s are very self-sacrificing in personal relationships. And they continuously notice other people, giving them attention and compliments and resources and advice. And they think Relationships are what matter most, and you can know what other people need if you just pay close attention. Twos often can confuse their feelings of others, can confuse other people's feelings as their own feelings. So they often tend to know what you need before you do. They're incredible helpers and givers. That's why they're called that. Often at a dinner party, after everybody's eaten, they're the ones taking the plate and doing the dishes. A quick story for you. My mother-in-law is a 2, and she's amazing.
Love Ann. She's
Love
great.
Ann, yeah.
Big fan.
She's good. So my mother-in-law, we just finished dinner, and I come into I leave the kitchen and to use the bathroom. I come back, and I grab a fresh glass out of the cabinet, and I fill it with water, and I down a little bit of it, and I put it on the table, and I turn around to look for something else in the fridge, and I turn back around, and she's already washed this glass and put it away. So this...
Too helpful.
Yes.
Over helpful.
They can be. But she knows she's attuned to the needs of my wife. My wife has a tendency to make sure everything is clean and spotless and in right order. And so her mom is already taking care of that. So they attune themselves to the needs of others. You look like you're going to say something.
No, I'm just thinking. Keep
Okay,
going. I'm sorry.
Cool. Sometimes 2s are actually known for introducing themselves by who they're in relationship with. So, hi, I'm the mother of so-and-so, or I'm the wife of Richard.
Someone just found out there are 2 in this room. There's no doubt. Gosh, what a good insight.
This is really important. 2s believe that their survival depends on sensing the needs of other people. And so people refusing their help can feel like rejection. So there's what's called also the lost childhood message for each type. The lost childhood message for the 2 is that you are wanted. And because they didn't hear it enough as a child or believe it to be true of them, the result is that they take on what's called the unconscious message that it's not okay to have your own needs. We talked about this with the 8, 9s, and 1s. Every type has a deadly sin. If you've heard of the 7 deadly sins in the Christian tradition, there's a deadly sin associated with each type. The sin for the 2 is pride. And pride in this sense refers to an inability or unwillingness to acknowledge one's own suffering. 2s deny many of their own needs while attempting to help others. This passion could also be described as vainglory, pride in one's own virtue for not having their own needs. So to finish up here with the 2s at their best are loving, caring, adaptable, insightful, generous, enthusiastic, tuned into how people feel, and at their worst, they are martyr-like, indirect, manipulative, possessive, hysterical, over-accommodating, and overly demonstrative. These are the more extroverted 2s. And then finally, 2s in the diagram move instinctively to the 4 space in secure situations and instinctively to the 8 space in stress.
All right, hey, I was just thinking as you were listing off the at their best, at their worst, can you repeat the quote? You've already used this maybe each week's about throwing a book across the room, like when you're discovering your type. Yeah. Just say this one more time in case anyone missed this the last couple weeks. Yeah,
so I've just heard a lot of people say, have you taken the test? Like the test? There's no such thing as the test. There's a bunch of different tests to help figure out what your type is. But a guy that I've learned a lot about the Enneagram from, he says the tests are a newer thing. And the way you would figure out your type in the past is read a book with really great descriptions. And the one that makes you want to throw the book across the room is the one that's probably naming the type that you are, because it's describing these like dark things you don't want to be true of you, but actually are if you just kind of are willing to look that direction.
Yeah, well, just wanted to remind people that, and some people might be kind of wondering what their type is as we go through this. So let's just talk about the 2s for a couple more minutes. And Seth, this is what I'm going to share is a very sort of unsophisticated, uneducated reaction to the description of 2s, and I'd love for you to speak to this. They seem really awesome, except for the manipulating people part and denying their own needs part. But I feel like in a more casual social setting, twos might come across as some of the most pleasant people there.
Absolutely.
In ways that some of the other types don't
Yep.
always.
Yep.
We're not into ranking. I mean, I don't want to go down a weird rabbit trail. I'm not saying twos are better than other types. But I actually talk about this because it seems like so much of the typical behavior of twos can come across as loving. I mean, I just began tonight by saying, one of the great commandment, or the second greatest commandment, to love others as ourselves. By this, all the commandments can be fulfilled. So, and this is so close to the heart of Jesus, that we would love others well. Yet, you talked in week 1 about the Enneagram is not so much about behavior, but motivation.
Right.
And so, if someone's here and they might think they're a 2, how can you encourage them with this balance of, there is something very beautiful and true to the calling of God to serve others, yet not if the point of serving others is to find fulfillment? Like how, I don't know if you have any encouragement or even how can we sort of filter, when do we have good motives, when do we have selfish motives? Just speak to this idea.
There's a lot of questions in there.
I'm terrible at asking questions. I usually just talk and then instead of asking. I'm the worst. I'm sorry.
No, you're good, man. So, the thing about every type is that your gift is your weakness. They're both and. It's the way that anything good becomes distorted if you're not kind of paying attention to it and not honoring it for its inherent goodness. So the thing about giving for twos is it becomes one of the ways that it's a defense mechanism for them. They learned early in childhood that the only way they're going to get their needs met and be loved is if they're giving of themselves at all times to people. And so in stress and unhealthiness, one of their defense mechanisms is to forget that I have my own needs and to just keep giving and giving and giving and giving and giving, and then they actually find themselves empty, and then resentful about the fact that I've given everything to you, and well, what are you going to do for me? But I've never voiced the fact that I have needs either, so you're kind of screwed at that point. But I don't know if I'm answering any of your questions.
Well, no,
there,
this is good. This is really, I do think it's helpful to talk about, and I feel like just listening to you say that now, it seems like one encouragement for someone who might be a 2 is to know that it's okay to say no.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
This is part of the lines of connection. If you, Brantley, if you go back to the diagram. So these lines, we haven't really gotten into these yet, but they're called the lines of integration or disintegration, depending on the author you're reading. So the 2 there, the arrow is pointing to the 8, and that's actually going against. So the 2 takes on 8 behavior in stress, and the 2 takes on 4 behavior in security. So what that means is the 2 is naturally moving toward other people. You kind of already heard me say that. They're trying to meet the needs of other people. That's how they know they're loved. 2s, when they move to 4s are more naturally withdrawn, and so they're actually finally taking care of themselves and thinking about their own needs. That's what's going on with the lines here.
Yeah, so if you think you might be a 2, take steps to surround yourself with people or put yourself in situations where you can identify what some of your own needs are. And so just going with that, one kind of follow-up question with the 2s. If maybe we are in close relationship to a 2, our best friend's a 2, our coworker's a 2, we're married to a 2, do you have any encouragement or suggestions for how we can, this is imperfect language, but basically not take advantage of them? I just imagine, if you're, say you're dating a 2, the 2 is probably always saying, hey, what can I do for you? What can I do for you? But how can we not take advantage of 2s? Again, maybe a crude way to phrase that question, but.
Yeah, well, honestly, sometimes it requires you asking them what they want and what they need over and over. I think each type tends to have actually some trigger words, and when you ask a 2 that you need something, the tendency is, oh, well, like I already said, that, well, this is how I'm going to get my needs met. This is how I know I'm going to be loved. I'm going to go ahead and answer that need. So just helping that person understand that they actually have their own needs and wants, and living into that, because it's become most natural for you to accept their help, because that's what they've done their whole lives. That's how that's how they know they're loved.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Seth. Should we move on to threes?
Yeah.
All right. You and I know a few threes.
Yeah. This is true.
Yeah. There's a lot of them in the church, not just our church, the church in America.
Yep.
I don't know. We might not get into that tonight. I have a tangent of sorts with that. But why don't you jump in with threes?
Cool. So the threes are they're often called the achiever or the performer. The key motivations for the three is that they need to feel valuable and worthwhile, to be affirmed, to distinguish themselves, to have attention, to be admired, to impress others, and to achieve success and avoid failure. Some people get ones and threes mixed up, and that's super easy to do. Threes avoid failure, ones avoid mistakes. There's kind of a big difference there. If you want to ask me later about that, you can. So threes are trying to become what they think we want them to be. Again, threes are a part of the identity, and they're very self-conscious and looking at other people. That's what the 2, 3s, and 4s are all doing. So threes subconsciously ask, what does this group want me to look like? And then they do it, and they become that thing. So they can alter themselves to be the poster child of any group that they want to belong to. They figure out what the credentials are required, and then they get them. So a story of a 3 to help you make sense of this. I was backstage with a 3 a couple years ago, and a lot of times 3s are kind of looking at names. They can't, not all 3s are this, but sometimes 3s can be name droppers because it's part of an achievement-based ideal. So we're backstage, and this 3 gets to talk with the front man of this band. And all of a sudden, you see this person's behavior start to morph, and he's mimicking the kind of behavior that he's seeing is cool or going to be admired or respected. That's one of their defense mechanisms. So 3s alter themselves to be whatever they see in front of them will give them respect or admiration. 3s often set aside their feelings in order to deal with them later, but very seldom get to later to deal with them. Feelings have to be suspended until the job is done, because feelings often they require you to hang out in them, and they block efficiency and effectiveness. So 3s have an unconscious need to succeed all the time at everything, largely because what they fear most is failing, being incapable, unimpressive, unable to do. That's a big one. Being second best, incompetent, inefficient, without merit, or exposed. And so they have a basic desire to feel valuable, worthwhile, accepted, and desired. So 3s are, multitasking people, and they're high-energy people, and they're performers who get a lot of things accomplished and a lot of things done. They often are natural salespeople and vision casters. They work long hours without a lot of downtime, and they rarely stop when they're sick, even. So 3s walk into a room and subconsciously think, what do I have to do to succeed in this environment? The focus of attention for the 3, again, this is where the type's energy naturally gravitates to without thinking. The 3's focus of attention is on favorable impression. 3s can manipulate others by charming them and by adopting whatever image will work. I heard a 3 say once that other people's perception of me in many ways defines my own perception of myself.
Ooh. Say that one more time.
Yeah.
For the 3s in the room.
Other people's perception of me in many ways defines my own perception of myself. So 3s are very image conscious in that they're often projecting this sort of version of themselves that's the highlight reel of who they are. So 3s fear failure, going back to the beginning of this, feel failure in that people will start to poke holes in this projection of the highlight reel of who they are, that people will start to see behind this sort of mask or this sort of highlight reel that they're always projecting, because they're one of the image conscious types. And they tend to believe that who they are is defined by what they do. And they can't imagine that you would love them for what's on the inside without all the achievements. So 3s tend to think that love is more about what you do than who you are. Again, the lost childhood message, for the 3, it's that you are loved for yourself without doing or accomplishing a single thing. And because they didn't hear it enough or believe it to be true, the result is that they take on this unconscious message that it's not okay to have your own feelings and identity. And again, the passion or the deadly sin for the 3 is called deceit. And deceit means deceiving themselves into believing that they are only their ego self, this projection that they're presenting to people. When they believe this, they put their efforts into developing their projection instead of their true nature. And I want to mention, too, a lot of people think deceit for 3s is just lying to people. It's not at all that. 3s don't consciously lie to people. It's this presenting this version of themselves and then convincing themselves that they are that, if that makes sense. So 3s at their best are optimistic, confident, industrious, very efficient, self-propelled, energetic, and practical. And 3s at their worst are deceptive, narcissistic, pretentious, superficial, vindictive, and overly competitive. 3s are very competitive. And 3s in the diagram move instinctively to the 6 space in security and instinctively to the 9 space in stress.
All right, so
That's the 3. Yeah,
that's the 3. I should mention before I make any more comments, my wife is a 3, and I love her very much. I shared last week I'm an 8, and so if you weren't here last week, we talked about some of my junk, and Seth's a 9.
Can I say one thing too?
Please.
Again, there's a misconception that your Enneagram type is your personality type. This is not pervasive of every person. This isn't like the only behavior 3s have. This isn't what's always going on for them. They are more than all of this. This isn't what's actually most true of them. This is sort of the organizing focus of attention for this type. There's a difference between personality. That's specific to you and you and you and you and you. Enneagram type is specific to a group of people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Now, I would suspect that some of you, especially if you are not familiar with the types before, are listening to some of the description of a 3. And even if it's not you or necessarily anyone you're close to, I imagine a lot of the language and phrases being used describe a lot of sort of cultural norms we see. And Seth, I just wonder if you could speak for a moment to the idea that some Enneagram teachers think certain countries sort of take on a type. Now, of course, millions or billions of people live in a country. It doesn't mean that all people are one type, but that certain cultural values exhibit a type. And you and I have heard people say that Enneagram teachers think America is a 3 as a country. Could you speak to that idea?
Yeah. It's the idea that, what does America value? Taking things to the next level. We value spectacle, and we value accomplishments and achievements and continually moving forward without even asking questions. Often I think actually technology precedes. Does that mean go before? Sometimes
it does.
Simple words are not helpful.
You're doing great. You're doing great with the words.
Technology very often precedes morality, and like before you ask, is this even okay? Technology often precedes, and I think that that's actually kind of reminiscent of what 3s can tend to do. They kind of can jump around corners and be okay with kind of half something,
Yeah.
just for the accomplishment's sake.
Yeah. We are a country that values accomplishment so much.
Yeah, and if you have a lot of accomplishments, then you're held at this esteem and this valuable. Yeah.
So something that I think is helpful, and one way the Enneagram can be helpful, is look at the environments you place yourself in and look at what behavior is typically rewarded and celebrated, and how might that perpetuate certain types feeling like they, I phrased that poorly, but look at what is celebrated or rewarded in the settings you find yourself, and often that can lead to a disproportionate number of types sort of ending up maybe in a certain type of workplace or in a certain even group of friends potentially. Mm-hmm. And it's not that that's so much a bad thing, but I do think it's important as Christians that we don't only exegete the scriptures, but we need to exegete our culture. What are our cultural values? How does the gospel speak to and challenge them? And that's one reason why I wanted to pause on the three from a cultural lens is so many things that America values can sort of come out in this language. And I think it's important for us to know this. Many of us might believe the lie that what we accomplish will determine our value. And the gospel of Jesus tells us we could never earn God's love. Right? We are loved just because we are his. And the gospel really challenges this idea that we can earn God's approval or earn God's affection. Of course, all 9 types need that message. There's a certain unique challenge to what kind of threes are motivated by, I think. You mentioned, just for the sake of helping maybe identify if this might be your type, threes are often pretty competitive, right? I heard, I've been told before, threes can maybe have a harder time than some of the other types being vulnerable. Is that true? Or, I don't know, speak to this idea of vulnerability in threes.
Yes, vulnerable in the things that aren't adding to this highlight reel of all their accomplishments. Yeah, kind of giving up the fact that they've had failures. You know,
so vulnerable might not be the right word. It's more specific than that.
Yeah, threes tend to not all threes. This is depending on your level of health and whatever. But threes can tend to kind of use a failure and immediately spin it the other way of the fact that I learned this, rather than let's just hang out in the fact that this doesn't represent you as a failure. This represents something didn't work. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's not doesn't resemble the fact that there's something wrong with you.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said that, because that even gets into how can we love the threes in our lives well. Maybe if you're having a potentially difficult conversation with a three or having to address conflict, from what you're saying, it sounds like it would be important if you're on the other side of a conversation with a three to remind them, I'm not talking about your character, I'm talking about this thing that happened. I'm not talking about how much I love you, I'm talking about this challenge we're facing. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not loved by what they do, they're loved just for the fact that they're them.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
All right, just have a little fun with this, since, again, that idea that Seth said you can know your type by read them and then throw the book across the room, that is almost exactly what happened when Lacey and I were introduced to the Enneagram. So the way I was introduced to the Enneagram was a few years ago. I guess the winter of 2010, heading into 2011, I'd taken a job at a new church who had recently taught the Enneagram to their staff, and they wanted me to get up to speed, so they mailed us a book on the Enneagram. I was at work, Lacey was home that day, and the package arrived in the mail. She opened it, flipped through the book, got to the 3, and had decided she was a 3, called one of her childhood friends to say, oh my goodness, I discovered this thing, it makes me feel so uncomfortable, and knew she was a 3 all before I got home that night. So I don't know if she literally threw the book across the room, but that is how she described it to me that night. She's like, they sent us this blue book, and it's crazy, and I'm this thing called a 3, and I don't know how I feel about it. That was how I learned the Enneagram. But
yeah, I was listening to a podcast, not a podcast, but some audio content on my phone, and I knew I can't throw this, but I actually did drop it.
Yeah,
because I just can't. Yeah.
So you ever listen to Luke Norsworthy's podcast?
Newsworthy with Norsworthy.
Newsworthy with Norsworthy.
Yep.
Has anyone else listened to this podcast?
He's a friend.
He's a friend of yours.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can maybe correct this if I get this quote wrong, but he was interviewing someone who had recently written a book on leadership, and he said, it was 3s, right?
The guy?
No, his take on the book, that most Christian leadership books are Enneagram 3s trying to justify their bad behavior. Is that, I'm getting the quote right, aren't I?
Yeah, I think that's right.
I think so.
I think that's right.
So, yeah, listen, I love 3. We love 3s. We work with a lot of 3s. Yeah, I might save another thought on where this plays out in the church for next week. But anything else on 3s before we go to 4s? All right, let's go to 4s. We're going to come back at the end of the night and answer questions anyway, so let's move on to 4s.
Cool. All right. It's a beautiful sound. Papers flipping. I I thought Brantley was holding a puppy, and I was thinking, no way. Oh my gosh, he is.
We've lost the room.
Oh gosh.
They're gone. Come on, Brantley. Not helping.
Where did that come
Not
from?
helping.
So
No, don't worry about where it came from.
Okay.
Focus.
All right.
Type 4.
Jeez. All right. The type 4. Type 4 is often called the romantic or the individualist. The key motivations for the 4 is that they need to want to be themselves. To express themselves in something beautiful, to be understood, to search for the meaning of life. They're very philosophical. To withdraw to protect their feelings, to take care of emotional needs before doing anything else. So 4s kind of feel like they came into the world with an essential piece of their makeup missing. And this piece is nowhere to be found, and it's kind of their fault. And the result is that they feel like they're different and that they don't fit in, that they don't belong anywhere, actually. Kind of like this misfit toy that gets ostracized to some far-off land. And they feel like no one else has this tragic flaw like they do. So they're always looking outside themselves for something they feel is inherently missing, which leads then to often having a kind of comparing mind. A friend of mine who's a 4, he's a guitar player, he's a singer-songwriter, and he's been trying to make an album for maybe 4 or 5 years. And because of the fact that he has this comparing mind, he's always comparing himself to the fact that, I'm trying to make this album, and other people have done a better job at it, and I want to make this, there's another version of this that's even better than mine. So they can have a hard time like creating content because they're always comparing it as less than somebody else's. So 4s have this unconscious need to be unique, to stand out, and to be different. Largely because what they fear most is being inadequate, emotionally cut off, plain, ordinary, commonplace, mundane, abandoned, and defective or flawed. And so their basic desire is to find themselves and their significance. The focus of attention for 4s is on what's missing. They walk into a room and subconsciously are just wondering what's missing about this situation, what's missing about what I need that everybody else seems to have. So they walk into a room and subconsciously think, how can I establish myself as being unique in this environment? How can I prove myself that I have something that for some reason I don't think I have? It's always this tension of push and pull here. So they believe that the only way they can recapture or compensate for their missing piece and secure identity is by projecting an image, one that differs them from everyone else. So this often means that they can have a melancholy or brooding vibe about them. 4s are pretty great with darker emotions. They're great with lament and pain. And a lot of people say that they're the most empathetic number. For 4s, authenticity is one of their incredible gifts. They don't like mediocrity or superficiality. And so 4s can definitely be leery of people who are always happy because life is filled with pain. And if you're always happy and always cheerful, well, then you're probably not all that authentic because there's more to life than just being happy all the time. It's said that 4s don't just have feelings, they are their feelings. This is because 4s base their identity on their internal feeling states. Sort of, I am what I feel. But the problem with this is that, feelings are always changing. So if their identity is based on feelings and their feelings are always changing, then their identity is always changing. And so rather than allowing the sort of spontaneous arising of feelings that is what's most natural for all of us, in response to the moment, 4s sort of stir up their emotions so that they reflect their unique identity. They try to intensify their feelings to bolster their sense of self. So to explain this, it's kind of the idea that, when they're moving into their comparing mind about you having something that I don't, that I'm missing, what they do in defense mode is they bolster their emotions because they are their emotions. Because if they don't have something, is this making sense? If they don't have something that you have, well, then they're losing their sense of self, and so they have to bolster their emotions so they know who they are. Does that make sense?
Maybe.
Maybe.
But it's okay. Keep talking.
Okay, we can come back to that.
Yeah, come back to that idea.
So 4s are pretty great at sitting in sadness, and they kind of really don't need to get out of sadness. They're just great with these deeper, darker emotions. But 4s can manipulate others by being temperamental and making others walk on eggshells. There is the lost childhood message for the 4, and for the 4s, it's that you are seen for who you are. And because they didn't hear this enough or believe it to be true of them in childhood, the result is that they take on an unconscious message that it's not okay to be too functional or too happy. The deadly sin or the passion for the 4 is envy. And again, envy is based on the feeling that something is fundamentally missing. Envy leads 4s to feel that others possess qualities that they lack. And 4s long for what is absent, but often fail to notice the many blessings in their lives. So to finish up with the 4s, at their best, 4s are warm, compassionate, introspective, expressive, creative, intuitive, supportive, and refined. And at their worst, 4s are depressed, self-conscious, guilt-ridden, moralistic, withdrawn, moody, and self-absorbed. And 4s, finally on the diagram, they move instinctively to the 1 space in secure situations and instinctively to the 2 space in stress.
Okay, so go back to that idea you had a moment ago where they might see something they're missing and it brings up emotions. So you saw that dog, that cute puppy in the back of the room, right?
Yes.
If you were a 4 and you had always wanted a cute puppy and you see someone else has the puppy, rather than just saying, oh, that's cute, I'd like that puppy, you might get really sad. I'm grossly oversimplifying this to try to put an example to what you said.
It can be something that you have that's a reflection, but it's more so a characteristic that's true of you that I don't seem to have. They often are measuring themselves up to other people to the point that they don't measure up to what you have that I don't. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's not so much that you have coffee and, oh gosh, well, that's a reflection of how
Okay. I really missed the point then. I think I'm getting it though. Yeah. A 4 might see someone who seems happy, and that triggers an emotion, maybe a stronger emotional reaction in a 4 than it might another type. Am I getting closer to what you're saying?
I think yes and no. Yes, because being happy, they definitely can tell themselves, well, if I was just a bit more happy, I might be able to make a bit more friends. I might be able to make more people happy. But I want that, but I can't just be happy because I have to also experience these darker emotions or these other emotions that are part of life as well, So.
Yeah. So I've been told 4s often become artists of some kind.
Yes. Not all 4s are artists. That's a stereotype for 4s.
Sorry, 4s who are not artists.
The way that I've heard it described is that 4s have such a complex inner world and such a deep inner world that it's really difficult sometimes to put into words the depth of complexity of what's going on inside of them. And so what does really, really good art do? It says something without saying something. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's why you can paint something and you have this crazy experience, but it would just kind of take away from it if you were to describe it.
Sure.
So 4s, because of their intense complexity on the inside, they often become artists because that's the best way they can get out what's going on inside. Yeah.
Art expresses what it's hard to put words to.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Something else someone had described to me before is kind of like a more lighthearted way of maybe identifying a 4. 4s are your friend who they like a musical artist when they think no one else has liked them, and then as soon as that artist starts getting popular, they're out on them because they felt unique that they were the one person who discovered them, and it frustrates them that artist has become mainstream.
Yeah, I think that can be very true. Yeah.
Again, we're stereotyping inherently, so if you're not a 4 and I just described you, that's okay. But some of these like sillier stereotypes can be helpful in taking steps toward like, oh yeah.
Yeah, well, I think there's a little truth underneath the surface with stereotypes, right?
Yeah.
It's not that that's pervasive of the actuality of that person, but there's something going on there with stereotypes.
I've not read this, Seth. This is just really subjective in my interactions with some of my friends. It seems like 4s might have a harder time identifying their types than some other types. Have you found that to be true, or do you think that's maybe just a fluke of some of the people I've known?
I have not actually found that very often. Usually 6s or 9s are the ones that have the most difficulty figuring out their type. Unless the 4 is a specific kind of 4.
Okay.
Yeah, I think from my understanding, most 4s can figure it out.
Yeah.
I thought I was a 4 at first.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's just because I had the stereotypical understanding of all 4s are artists.
Yeah, you're a
Oh, must be a
songwriter.
4. Yeah.
I have feelings.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why you don't like any of these stereotypes, is you were miscast as a 4 for a while. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Yeah, I think just kind of going back to how some of these things play out in our culture, and I would say now specifically in American Christianity culture, or American Christianity, we can have a tendency to label certain emotions or feelings as bad. And if we're really in an intimate relationship with Jesus, we are not going to feel these negative feelings. And I think there's something really beautiful about a 4's ability to lament and a 4's ability to not run from the sadness. We talked before we started this series, I don't think you were with us, about how all feelings can have a redemptive edge to them. They can be things that God uses to point us toward Christ, toward him. I think those of us who are not 4s can probably learn a valuable lesson that we don't always have to say we're happy and project an image of success, achievement, gladness. Anything else that you think we can learn from 4s?
Yes. There's so many things you can learn.
All right, we'll come back to that again. We'll give them some time to discuss
Yeah.
at tables. Any encouragement, if someone is a 4, just how would you want to encourage them?
That's another good question. I think, 4s tend to have this this tension inside of them that I want to belong, and they also want to stand out. And it does come from the fact that they over-identify with their emotions, because their emotions kind of tell them what's true. For 4s, you are unique. You kind of don't have to prove yourself. You already are unique. And I think that's one of the things that they can get caught up in. That's part of the thing, is all 2, 3s, and 4s is they're all trying to prove themselves in some way. They're trying to prove that their image is worth something, Yeah,
great. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to take about 10, 15 minutes and talk at your table, sort of react to what Seth shared. I have some suggested questions that I think I got to most of the tables. Use them if they're helpful. You don't need to. And then Seth and I will sort of walk around the room and just say hey to everybody. And if you've got some questions you think might, speak to most of the room, around 7:30, 7:35, if you need to leave then, that's cool. But we'll come back up for another 10 or 15 minutes and do our best to answer a few more questions. Thank you guys for hanging so long. If you'll stay with us, we might just talk for 5 or 10 more minutes. And then, of course, you're welcome to hang out as late as you'd like to tonight. But I hope this has been helpful. It seemed like there were some pretty rich conversations going on. I'm just curious, did anyone sort of come in tonight not really quite sure of what your type is, and currently you think you might be a 2, 3, or 4? I'm not going to embarrass you or anything, but just curious. Okay, a couple people. All right, cool. Very cool. Did anyone come in tonight at the beginning of the night thinking you might be a 2, 3, or 4, and now you're less sure of that? Okay, all right, neat. Okay, so Seth, last week when we talked about 8, 9s, and 1s, this came up a little bit, but we hadn't yet spoken about 3s. So now that we've talked about 3s as well, I'd love to talk about maybe how people can confuse 1s and 3s. Can you just speak to that for a moment?
Kindly. Yes, 1s and 3s, they're both very much about accomplishing things and kind of achieving things. But the difference between the two, 3s, I said this earlier, I think, 3s fear failure. 1s fear mistakes. 1s fear mistakes because their lost childhood message is that you are good, and that making mistakes reminds them of that. It kind of touches on that. It kind of, hits that trigger. 3s fear failure in that this is the the highlight reel that I'm presenting. And if you start to see holes through this projection of myself, then that's gonna show you that I'm a failure, that I'm not any more than my accomplishments.
So ones, they're driven by this sort of self-determined idea of what is right. Threes, more driven by what they think other people think is right.
Yes, ones have an internal moral standard, and threes are looking to you to know what to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we can, if that's still confusing, or maybe you're having a hard time understanding, whether or not you identify as a 1 or a 3, maybe just ask Seth.
Let me also say, ones have a standard, and they're going to reach the standard, and then they're going to keep raising the standard. Ones because they're adding accomplishments to their projection, they're moving on, and they're okay with like cutting corners. Ones will not do that. Cutting corners speaks to the fact that they're moralistically, they can't do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I want to talk a little bit, too, about possible distinctions between 2s and 3s and how it might be possible to struggle at typing those two. We talked about both tonight, obviously. Both have a component where there's an others focus, or they're looking to others to kind of understand themselves a little bit. Let me see if I can get this right. 2s are more driven by the need to be needed by others. 3s are more driven by the need for others to see them as successful. Right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you're right. 3s are looking for other people for admiration and respect. 2s aren't really looking for respect as much as they're looking to be able to meet your needs. 3s aren't really looking to help you as much as they're looking to help you if that's going to move forward their agenda.
Yeah. So 3's behavior could look like a 2's behavior if in that particular cultural setting it is incentivized to appear helpful.
Totally.
But
yeah.
the driver is not to be helpful. The driver is to appear successful in that environment.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Someone asked me, and I'm so glad they did because I made this note myself and I just forgot to say it. There's a common lost childhood message with each of the 9 types, and you've been sharing those, and I hope you guys found that helpful. However, it's worth mentioning, not every person will identify with that lost childhood message. And don't be offended by that, please. And I can say this as someone who I'm sure that I identify as an 8, and I don't really identify with the lost childhood message of an 8. So I'm kind of raising my hand with that. It can be a helpful kind of diagnostic in learning your type, but there's certainly exceptions. And if maybe even next week, depending on how much time we have, we can get into some of the subtypes and some of the nuances of the different types. But lost childhood message is helpful. Don't get hung up or derailed by that message as you're trying to discern your type. Anything you would add to that point?
Yeah, I would say that the lost childhood message for the 9, that your presence matters. 9's not knowing that. I don't entirely relate to that, but I absolutely do relate to the unconscious message that it's not okay to assert myself.
Yeah.
And some of that's verbiage, the way you word that too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't think it's okay to assert myself. And especially that's like I would say I'm assertive, but it's more of an unconscious thing. Like I've done a lot of watching myself and studying myself and paying attention to my patterns. And so I've become aware of the fact that when something falls in front of me, I'm watching other people go to pick it up. And then I realize, oh, I could have helped. It's one of the ways that presents itself.
Huh, that's really interesting. I appreciate sharing that. Well, at this point we've talked about 6 of the 9 types. We'll talk about the last 3 next week. I just want to encourage those of you who maybe still don't quite identify your type, or maybe even find yourself really indifferent as to whether or not you care to know your type. Like I said at the beginning of tonight, we're not doing this so that you can know a number that you put yourself into a box with. We're doing this because we want to catalyze some conversations about why do we do some of the things we do? How can we grow in compassion and empathy to love other people well? And as we can identify those things, maybe we can start to see habits of sin, barriers in intimacy with God, and other things that will help us grow in our relationship with Christ. And so as you leave here tonight, if it's fun to keep talking about this, if you find it helpful or edifying to keep talking about this, do so. I know Seth and I both would be happy to just talk until we get in our cars tonight about the little, are you this type or that type? And here's a way, it's fun for some of us to talk about that. But for all of us, that's not the goal. The goal is that you would leave here thinking more about the behavior and the patterns in your life, and how we can connect with others and God well. Seth, I've got just a couple announcement type things, but anything else you want to say about the Enneagram or the Triad that we touched on tonight?
No, thanks.
Okay. Hey, would you guys thank Seth one more time? This has been great, man. Thank you.